Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to see you all. I'm Brooks. I'm on the faculty development team. Welcome to Primetime at the BU Library. Primetime at the BU Library is a collaboration of friends of the BU Library and many different offices on campus with the mission of encouraging lifelong learning beyond the classroom for faculty, students, and staff. On Tuesday, October 11th, Edie Sosi, Vice President of Student Life, will present the preliminary findings of a qualitative research study to learn how students and faculty make sense of gender relations and roles, entitled Gender Dynamics in and Outside the Classroom at Bethel University College of Arts and Sciences. Good topic. Today we welcome Angela Sabates, Associate Professor of Psychology, as she discusses the main premises of her new social psychology textbook, which is currently being edited by InterVarsity Press. Let's welcome Angela as she presents humans as social and/or selfish, competing perspectives.
Thank you, and good morning. I think that you should know, as I was preparing this, I grant you that I was preparing it last night, the PowerPoint, all the animations have changed and then don't work. So I had some fancy things coming in and going out, and now none of it is working. So you'll have to, on occasion I'll point to it and tell you, here's where it's coming in. So as Keith said, I am going to be talking this morning about some of the main premises of the textbook that I have just completed the first draft of. I'm sure it's not the end of my editing of it. But it is, of course, about social psychology. And I know that we have a few people out from outside of our department here today, so we'll talk a little bit about that. Of course, you can't read any of these because the text is too small, so I'll point out to you just a few things by way of example. I am very interested in two levels of exploration in psychology. I'm interested in smaller questions. And by smaller, I don't mean less important. I mean more precise questions about human social behavior. I'm especially interested in what the compilation of all of those, and especially themes that are recurrent, what they suggest to us about the human condition. And so many of these smaller questions, like for example in self-perception, how do we develop our self-concept? Is self-esteem always a good thing? And how do we perceive other people? Are we always inclined to perceive them in a way that is very self-centered and self-seeking? What forms of social influence take part in everyday life, like in groups or when we're working individually? And antisocial behavior, primarily aggression and racism and prejudice, and also pro-social behavior like helping, and what are some of the potential motives for that. So there have been over 60 years now of social psychological research looking at these very questions. And what I am very interested in is to look at the relationship between these smaller questions and larger ones. And so specifically for the purpose of this text, although there are many large questions, of course, we could explore, one of them has to do with what, if any, are the purposes or the meaning of human social interaction, and how is that related to the human condition? How is the purpose of our living in community related to the sorts of individuals or beings that we actually are? So that is the point where the textbook most focuses, in the intersection between the assumptions about the human condition and subsequent behavior. So you should know, by the way, that historically psychologists haven't actually formulated very large meta-theories about the human condition, with some exceptions, of big-name psychologists I'll show you in a moment, and with the exception of more recent evolutionary psychology. So I am saying tongue-in-cheek, I should have put the word uplifting in quotes, because it's a rather dismal view of the human condition that psychology provides for us, and I'll explain in just a moment, with some exceptions. We had a brief interlude of the humanists who claimed, Maslow and Rogers and the like, who claimed that humans underneath it all were actually very good. And they were an exception in our field. Maslow, interestingly, toward the latter part of his life, after working with humans for several decades, actually said in an article that I've come to the conclusion that some humans are so reprobate, there's only one solution, and that's to take them out to the back and shoot them in the head. But still, we're pretty good. So there was a concession made. But let's just look at just a very, very skimming the surface historical view of what psychology tells us. Freud, of course, said that we are savage beasts. Skinner, that we're nothing but empty shells. Ellis, the famous cognitive theorist, that we're fallible, screwed up, unfair, that's the human condition, and so forth. And at this point, at least within the last decade especially, the most prevalent meta-theory is evolutionary psychology. And this is the focus of some of our discussion here. And basically, this is a very brief review, and I'm happy to talk with anyone at more length about it. But for those of you who are not aware of this, this is basically the idea that we are, all of social behavior, and all of cognition and emotion and so forth, is a vestige of our evolutionary past. So whatever we see people engaging in now was at some point beneficial for the survival of our ancestors. And so as a result of that, things like aggression or competition or racism or prejudice are often interpreted in that light as part of our natural, if you will, endowment from our ancestors. And so the human mind is like a computer that has very specified, this is a very controversial assumption, by the way, that has very specified mental modules that handles this or that situation. And it, depending on which evolutionary psychologist you read, it tries to avoid genetic determinism and accounts for the effect of culture and immediate experience, but ultimately, in the highly reductionistic mode, everything is reduced back to something that was, at one point in our history, evolutionarily advantageous for us. And we'll look at some of the implications of that. So, if you assume these premises, which most psychology textbooks do now, and I have actually witnessed, especially in the last decade, not even decade, maybe 9 years, the proliferation of evolutionary theory to explain social behavior, such that now the textbook is almost all evolutionary psychology at the exclusion of most other things, whereas that was not historically the case. So if you begin with these assumptions that human behavior can be reduced to these evolutionary advantages, then we have a variety of different assumptions. And keep in mind that I'm giving you just the gist of them. If you read independent evolutionary theorists, they vary somewhat on this or that or their emphasis, but there's a general consensus about a variety of these things. One of them is we are all mate seekers. So we all are at various points in life primarily motivated by attracting the attractive people of the opposite sex. And so there's an interesting series of studies about something called blatant benevolence and conspicuous consumption, in which they have males and females in a variety of different experimental conditions with attractive people of the opposite sex, and they watch their behavior. They're given a certain number of points or allocation of tokens, and they can spend them however they want. The males in these experiments typically tip a lot more or choose to spend a lot more money, things that give the illusion that they have a lot of money, which presumably attracts females. And then females act just blatantly benevolent. You've never seen them dedicate more time to volunteer work, except in these studies with the attractive male. Then a number of evolutionary psychologists say that we're not only mate seekers, we're narcissists at heart, because pride is very adaptive. It promotes thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are oriented toward increasing, maintaining one's place within the social hierarchy. So pride is actually beneficial for us in that it gives us a certain prestige or status. I'll talk about self-centeredness in just a few moments. And then perhaps most uplifting at all, we are natural-born killers. And so let me just draw your attention to David Buss, a prominent evolutionary psychologist who wrote a book famously entitled The Murderer Next Door, How the Human Brain is Designed for Killing. And it is, I don't know if this is urban legend, but he has among the most number of books on serial killers ever in his personal library. So I find that very interesting. Well, just recently, he and his colleague published an article that follows on some earlier theorizing, explicating this homicide adaptation theory. And his point was that we need to come to the realization that while in the past, evolutionary psychologists have claimed that homicide was an aberration. It's actually not part of our natural endowment, but it's more cultural. So war brought this on, and other things that reinforce it. Buss and his colleagues are making the argument that no, in fact, homicide was a very adaptive strategy because it helped kill competitors. It helped males, for example, show their athletic prowess, which was presumably more attractive to females, and so forth. So now, at least his latest thinking is that we are primed to watch the person seated next to you. And then ultimately, kindness exists, but it struggles to stay afloat on a notion of cruelty that is the default condition for organisms competing for existence on this planet, and other such very uplifting kind of commentary. All right, now, why isn't this moving? Should I be pointing it elsewhere? Okay. It's not all bad, though, and that's the good news.
Amen.
Okay, well, let's see. We have compassion. And in fact, the brain is biologically wired for compassion, according to evolutionary theory. That's good news, sort of. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. Then we have the whole realm of positive psychology and its interaction with social psychology, the study of human virtue, strength, perseverance, gratitude, forgiveness, and the like. And you emerge with a seemingly more optimistic view on the human condition. It's quite ironic, though. I teach senior seminar, and the focus of that is positive psychology. How, if you look at this literature more broadly, the dependent variable are usually things that are self-seeking. So, for example, subjective well-being, personal fulfillment, happiness. And you may have seen in the media a number of works written about happiness. And a student just dropped off at my office, Seeking Pleasure, a book, not pornographic, by the way. It's a book on how you can maximize your relishing of life. And so even though it's the study of virtue, it's a study of virtue towards an end, and the end is self-seeking, right? So this is a very interesting, a very important distinction here that we need to draw. All right, so if you begin with these premises then, and by the way, let me clarify that the text does not seek to refute evolutionary theory per se, does not seek to refute evolutionary psychology per se. It directly addresses the naturalist premises, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. So if you begin with those set of criteria, as any researcher begins with a bias, part of the concern that I have is that there's a way in which that bias limits the generation of hypotheses. It will limit the sorts of questions that you allow to be asked. It also limits the amount or the types of interpretations you can make. So just one example, if you look at altruism, and you look at the self-seeking, self-sacrificing things that people do, even to the extent of risking their own lives. One cognitive social psychologist, whose name I was trying to find recently and I can't now, noted as one possible interpretation of those things is that when an individual confronts a stranger in an emergency situation and risks their own life, what has happened is that the mental module in the brain that is primed or specialized for recognizing related others somehow gets distorted and gets fooled into thinking that the other is your related, that you're kin. So individuals, for example, when the bridge collapsed in Minneapolis, people who jumped spontaneously out of their cars, this theorist would claim that this is an overactivation of the mental module for familiarity. And so the interpretations in some way are forced to fit the naturalist premises. They will not allow for, with some exceptions I'll talk about, in general, for a broader range of explanations, right? So this is the concern that I have. And so the text, what it does is presents the reader from the outset with a very explicit, or a set of explicit premises based on one possible, by the way, not the authoritative Christian perspective, but one possible Christian perspective based on Christian orthodoxy, creation, fall, and redemption. The question that I'm most interested in is what would our interpretation of the data look like if we allowed for the possibility that God exists and that in fact human social interaction is of the utmost importance in his redemptive plans, that it actually has some purpose and some meaning. And so that's the nature of the textbook. And in a moment you'll see how confusing that was. So we begin with this orthodox premise, essentially God along and through nature versus nature alone, and using more of what's called a theocentric approach, which has to do with considering God as the prime agent. And however much we may misunderstand his intent, at least we understand that they are there, they exist, versus a totally anthropocentric, human-only directed kind of process. Okay, so this is the key distinction here in the textbook. And so what I'm doing is grossly oversimplifying the text, but for our purposes here, what I do then is I begin by asking the students to consider the possibility that we are created by God. Now, if so, and it's not a book on theology nor apologetics about the existence of God. In fact, I cite Alistair McGrath, who says that we may look at nature and find a certain coherence in it that justifies our beliefs, doesn't prove them, but rather is consistent with them. And that's what the book is, not an apologetics to prove God's existence or to make him somehow a dependent variable or an independent variable, but rather to open the mind of the student to consider these possibilities, which are virtually unheard of in the field. So if we begin from the premise of creation, and these will seem very simplistic to you because they're very straightforward and orthodox, that we are created in God's image, which implies something about the potential for other-centeredness, to live in community as part of the redemptive plan on earth that God has ordained. Now, in order for us to be able to live that sort of community life, there must be within humans some measure, at least, of the capacity for, I know virtue gets to be tricky, but of other-centeredness. And I'm acknowledging that this is an arguable point, right? And you could probably empirically go in different directions. But if we started with that premise, and we also acknowledge that humans are limited beings, and by this limitations, I explained in the text, I don't mean sin, I mean just limitations in social perception, as research indicates. We cannot perceive all things accurately. So even if we did not have sin, would we be able to see absolutely clearly in everyday life interactions, right? So we have creation. Then we have the fallenness that brings a certain brokenness to this issue and to social interaction. And then redemption that happens at different levels, of course, with Christ as the Redeemer, but us acting as agents of redemption through Christ's grace with each other in many different social situations. Now, therefore, if you start with those premises, human social interaction has a variety of different emphases here. It reflects our created goodness, our corrupted nature, and functions within the redemptive plan. And this Christian approach can hold the tension of goodness and fallenness together. It does not dismiss offhand. It does not have, for example, a Pollyannish view that, oh, with Christ's grace we are just loving people. Rather, it acknowledges the potential for savagery that is a part of our brokenness, while simultaneously considering the created goodness, the potential that still remains, such that, for example, when we see altruism, we may conjure different sorts of explanations, one of which is what Batson called a pluralism of motives, among which may be genuinely other-centered motives, right? So we're talking about attention here. And let me just draw your attention to one example of how the difference between a naturalist and a Christian premise may occur. All psychologists recognize that humans are intrinsically relational beings. That is not new, by the way, and it wasn't psychologists who invented that, by the way, even though we act as though we did. So a potentially naturalist explanation, there's an article written, How Social an Animal, which is very interesting. Most of the naturalist premises regarding the fact that we are intrinsically relational are self-serving. We are, to quote a number of researchers, social egoists. So we are really kind and friendly, but ultimately if it costs us, we will often not engage in whatever the process is, right? So this is just different. I'm just sampling. These are symbolic of the ethos at large. One possible Christian interpretation is that the social nature is actually created, right? And it seems simplistic. It is created with a purpose, with an end in mind. The created nature gets distorted by self-seeking ends, for sure, but it's not just or primarily that, all right? So the one thing I want to point out as we go through the next slides, at some points it will seem to you kind of disjointed because, in fact, it is. And the reason for that is because when I began writing this textbook, I thought, this is fabulous. I've been teaching social psychology now for 12 years, have all these ideas. I'm going to put together a table, and then it'll be a checklist table. And at the end of each chapter, I will check off how I've integrated these various components. After chapter 3, I realized that this was going to be a ridiculous venture, and it made the text actually all the more riveting and horrifying for me, because I thought, what will I do? And then I realized numerous times why no one else has done it. I realized now I know why, despite the fact that back in the 80s, Mary Stuart Van Leeuwen, a prominent social psychologist, argued that of all of the subdisciplines of psychology, it is social psychology that should have some deliberate integration, and she never wrote after that about it. Now I see why. I don't know, a number of authors have tried to do this, but in any case, each chapter asks questions at different levels. In some, and I'll give you an example of this now here. Well, no, we can't. In some chapters, the questions have to do about precise proposals of precise new hypotheses that are based on Christian premises. Within the same chapter, there may be a discussion with the student about looking at an alternate set of explanations based on a Christian model. So both the hypothesis generating, the explanation of the data, and then other times it's, look how interesting this all is. And then ask the student questions, which is a great way to get out of having to do that. So if you look, I'm just going to draw a few examples because we won't have time actually to go through all of the slides I prepared, but just as a sampling of the way this could work. Right, so if you look at the issue of self-esteem, and you know that self-esteem is a very hot topic in our culture, and back in the 80s, the governor of California invested hundreds of thousands of dollars in implementing self-esteem programs across the schools. And when I asked my students, how many of you were a part of some kind of self-esteem program, invariably some hands are raised and so forth. And so the premise was, if we increase self-esteem, we'll have a number of positive social outcomes. We will drop teenage pregnancy rates, we will curb crime, we will, it's like the second coming of Christ. Let's raise self-esteem, and then it will be a panacea. And I'm exaggerating for effect, but not really. So then a number of researchers said, oops, well, okay, maybe that was a little over the top. And Baumeister and Bushman especially did a series of very interesting studies in which they look at, the bottom line is, what we've done is created a nation of narcissists. And in fact, much of this high self-esteem is fragile self-esteem. So when a person with a fragile self-esteem is threatened, what do you suppose the response is? Like, oh, praise God, I have such a high self-esteem. It's actually often retaliatory. So, for example, the long-held notion that youth who are criminals have a really low self-esteem is actually not well substantiated by the research. And in fact, there's a bit of narcissism in the sense of entitlement. I can steal from you, I can take from you, and so forth. So it discounts some of the cultural lore about how important self-esteem is. Now, what I note in the book, and I know that this will sound like hindsight bias, that is, I knew it all along. Look, I could have told you that. But if one begins with a Christian, perhaps a biblical view of humanhood, and you look at biblical mandates against pride and how frequently they occur, you begin with the understanding that pride is a particular vulnerability for us. So it should be held as suspect. The idea of increasing self-esteem offhand should be highly suspicious to us. Furthermore, what's very, very interesting to me is that if you look at, I surveyed different self-esteem programs, and they are focused on the self, right? So the students are taught cognitive strategies or behavioral strategies to increase self-worth. And that got me to thinking about this scripture, particularly about love your neighbor as yourself. And it occurred to me that none of the self-esteem programs that I had researched had looked at simultaneously raising a sense of self-worth along with considering the worth or the dignity of others or another. Right? So do you understand the distinction? And I thought, in this particular part of the chapter, proposing a series of hypotheses that would test programs that looked at those that focus most on the self and increasing self-image, as compared to those that do both, showing people how integral other and self-worth are to each other, how inextricable they are. Right? So that's an example of where a specific hypothesis might emerge from the data. I know we're moving quickly, but we'll have time at the end. I'm moving fast so we can ask questions. Okay, altruism, once again, you can imagine, there's a great deal of controversy about whether this exists, the idea of selfless giving to others, and numerous interpretations, as I mentioned briefly before. Primarily, many researchers say that ultimately it's for reputation, for when we help. It increases your reputation, it increases how you feel about yourself, you expect reciprocity. These are the primary motives, they're all self-seeking. These researchers noted we need to just stop talking about self versus other-centered. Notice how in groups, parents will, and this is their explanation of other-centered, parents of children will be more likely to help the children of other parents because they know that in the future, their children will be helped by those children. And then that period, the end. So I read it again, and I read it again, I had other people read it, and I thought, have I missed something here about what part of this is other-centered? Because it's very hard when you begin with that premise of evolutionary advantage to think of other-centeredness. It's very difficult, logically. Whereas from beginning with a Christian premise, you can consider these, as I said earlier, pluralism of motives. You can actually you can actually examine, you can be open to the possibility, to the questioning, or even to the interpretation. One cognitive theorist, when she was asked, why is it that people give their lives for other people, how is that looking out for one's own, how is it that people who risk their lives for strangers are acting not self-centered, are acting self-centeredly? Because there they compromise their survival and they're acting for a stranger who's not going to promote their genetic inheritance. And she began to respond by saying, well, that's because it's good for the species. And then the interviewer asked her again, well, how is that not self-centered? And ultimately she said, oh, this is the theorist who said, well, it must be that somehow our mind is tricked. We must think that we're saving someone who's going to propagate our genes. And this was in a peer-reviewed journal. And that was the end of the discussion. That's the bias. All right, so moving right along. Then we asked the question, are humans mostly self-centered? If you look at the self-literature, there's a self-serving bias, self-centered tendencies, and so forth. More recent research is looking at things that are really interesting in terms of just how self-centered are we. And these researchers are looking at interpersonal social behavior versus group and individual behavior, right? So what they're finding is an implication for a quieter ego. This is a really soft way of saying maybe people can be other-centered. This is beautiful, very soft and melodic, the implication for a quieter ego. And I'm speaking quietly to emphasize the point that this, because it's so hard to imagine how you can be other-centered if there's not a self-seeking motive, right? Okay. Groups, or we'll talk about later. Reducing aggression. In the aggression chapter, I review all of the research on various types of aggression. For example, outright hostile aggression, the undercurrent of scathing commentary, verbal aggression. One social psychologist reviewed all of the violent crimes throughout history since the Middle Ages and concluded that we actually have less per capita violent crime now than ever before, which is a great finding. And the question that I ask is, well, that's good for hostile violence. What does that tell us about the undercurrent of other types of symbolic violence or aggression or verbal aggression or nonverbal aggression and so forth? So the question is still really very much out there. When I surveyed all of the, or as much as I could of the aggression reduction techniques, once again, these use cognitive training, behavioral training, peer mentoring. You can imagine a whole host of them. Many of these are applied in school settings. They're very often specific to the context. So aggressors in domestic violence, aggressors in the schoolyard, and so forth. And one thing that's very interesting that researchers have been saying for a long time actually is that humanizing, in other words, seeing the dignity and the value of the other's life, is related to reduced aggression towards that other. So there's a whole series of interesting experiments where, as the other becomes increasingly dehumanized, with wearing a paper bag over their head or being partitioned from you, the greater the number of shocks you give, or the greater the insult you hurl at them. And this happens in everyday life during times of war, how we portray the enemy, we dehumanize, we speak of groups as though they were a totality, right? So that's consistent with what we would imagine. But what is very interesting and what has been largely missing from aggression research is the issue of, for example, here's an example where a biblical mandate may be relevant to research, specifically now forgiveness. And so there are a host of studies now, especially in the last 5 years, especially with the study of genocide in Rwanda, with youth in, now as we speak, a series of studies being done with violent youth in cities all across Western Europe and the US, and showing some initial promising results because forgiveness had not been considered previously as a major factor in aggression reduction research. And so it's an example of how one biblical concept may be relevant there as well. Okay. All right, so I know this is good because we'll have some time for questions. The goals of the book are, while on the one hand they seem quite grand, they're really actually, in my mind, more simple. And primarily, the goal is to give the students one tool of many that they will use, no doubt, and faculty to engage in a very fluid style as you are reading, as opposed to having separate tables, but as you are reading, to engage the questions deeply, to understand that unspoken assumptions guide this research. Often, the assumptions either are not spoken or they're implicit or they're hinted at, taken for granted. We know that genuine other-centeredness is very near impossible. It's not part of our natural endowment, as though this were a fact, a natural law. And what I'm doing is trying to encourage the students to question those, to see where they are consistent with our understanding of Christian personhood, period. All humans are created in God's image, not just Christians. To think about what the implications are of beginning with those two different sets of premises for hope for human social interaction. So until very recently, it was believed, for example, that racism was an inevitable part of our natural endowment. Now that has been questioned in recent years. So if we begin with the premise that we can only go so far, maybe all we can do is reach a state of peaceful coexistence, as opposed to the potential for a true reconciliation among people. I mean, racism is just one example. And so it's hope that is tempered by a realism about the really dark side of us that exists, and it exists for believers, non-believers, everyone. It's by virtue of our nature. And to consider, to open our minds more, the possibility of different kinds of either hypotheses or programs to implement or to research that are based on some biblical premises having to do with that hope that's restored. Because the hope that I'm talking about is not whether or not we're going to devise just the right kind of programs. It doesn't emanate from us, hence the theocentric approach. And the notion that the human condition, that we need to ask the question, is the human condition as dark as evolutionary psychology leads us to believe? And if that's the case, then what we are hoping to achieve as a human community is limited. It's limited anyway because we're human, but it is limited because it is constrained by the refusal to acknowledge some other possible explanations for or understandings of the human condition. So that's very quick, but I wanted to leave time for discussion and questions. I skipped over some slides because I could give you numerous examples of how I actually do this in the chapters, but as I was running through them, I realized that could get confusing because it's at different levels of explanation and different levels of... So you've seen a sampling of some of those kinds of things. Yes, Ash?
I had a question just regarding, I mentioned you were citing Pinker as the person who did this study of violence in human history. It's something like, it was 50% of people met their death violently, and now there's 52%, and that includes families.
Right.
So one of the things that we talk about quite frequently in neuroscience is that we have, because of technological development, we've got so many people who are coming back with brain injury from war. And so we have these walking wounded that, what do we do with them? Well, we don't really know because they've never survived previously. Do you think that there's some sort of version of that essentially we are now confronted with a series of walking wounded in sort of a relational fashion, because instead of these people disappearing to death, getting a violent death, now they still exist, and we got more of them in society than we've ever had before.
And is your question about what are the implications of that in terms of it?
Oh, I guess I'm wondering, is there something similar that, we talk about, now we have to worry about all sorts of traumatic brain injuries that we never had to worry about before. In sort of a relational fashion, we've now got a ton of incredibly damaged people that otherwise would have disappeared to their violent end, that now we have to worry about because they aren't dying necessarily. And this gets toward what we were talking about in terms of aggression. Violence is diminished, but aggression has a diminished.
Well, I think an interesting area of research has to do with compassion in that regard, and the capacity for compassion, because if you look at, for example, helping behavior, often it's equated with empathy. How much can you understand the other's perspective? And one of the things I note in the textbook is that the command, to help one another, to love one another, isn't necessarily based on empathy, which has been the focus of research. But compassion is a broader term, I think, that I'm still working that out. I just propose it as a question to the students. This actually may be fruitful. I mean, this will sound totally utilitarian, but it may be fruitful for research on how do we handle the most vulnerable members of our group, actually, because this is unprecedented in terms of medical advances and the like. And what do we do with that? What is our potential for that? And both for the good and the bad, actually. How are they ostracized? How are they demeaned? And so forth. So I don't think I've quite answered your question, but I can see an avenue of research in that regard.
It feels like it might provide some explanation for the increasing diagnosis of certain disorders, as instead of just, oh, well, we've got more people doing diagnosis, there are actually more of these.
Okay. Yes, Robin?
Who do you assume the audience would be for this? Where will it use?
I think initially in the CCCU campuses, in undergraduate psychology. I'm also making connections with a variety of different Catholic institutions who may be interested in integrating and looking at a Christian view of humans. I don't imagine that a secular institution will be interested in it. It's whoever it is. Right. Why is your question?
No, I just want, I mean, I think as another explanation, it would be wonderful to be used with different
Yes.
institutions.
And this might be the right time, very postmodern, let's consider different. And there was Muslim psychology as well that's being considered. Who's it?
Hi, Angela. This sounds really interesting. I can't wait to see it, read the book. It occurs to me, I can see why you said that you weren't going to deal with an apologetic. First of all, say, this is the groundwork for me having this discussion. Christ, Jesus is the Christ, and he really was raised from the dead. Obviously, you couldn't do that. But it strikes me that, but you're also being unapologetic about the fact that if you see the problem a specific way, then the solutions are going to tend to be seen a specific way. So you're adding another element of a way of looking at this, which I think is great. The thing that strikes me is that, like you just said, there's a, like Muslim psychology, or kind of an Islamic way of maybe looking at human relationships and problems. Because it strikes me that Christianity obviously doesn't have the monopoly.
That's right.
on other-oriented relationships. I mean, someone like Gandhi, a religious, not really Hindu, but a religious, eclectic, could say that he was willing to die for the cause of social justice for the other, but there was no cause for which he was going to kill.
I should have mentioned that. I do mention that in the second chapter, but this is not. But I'm writing now from a Christian view of Christ's redemption, and not assuming that it's Judeo-Christian, it's Islamic. It's
because I mean, to me, it's almost like the broader theme is that an ideals, or belief-oriented, which it could be in this particular case Gandhi's particular version of eclectic Hinduism, or as Christians, that people will do things knowing based on a belief that I'm going to do something that is good for the other, even if it costs me. And that's clearly goes against this evolutionary model that you were talking about. Because in the other model, it would be I'm going to do it, but ultimately, when push comes to shove, if it isn't good for me, I'm not going to do it. But I was just curious, because.
Well, I did. I had a specific limit of the number of words I could use, which sounded to me ridiculous. Starting from and I can't remember what it is because I just blocked it out of my memory. Starting from the title, including everything, the glossary, the references alone were 105 pages, to the very end, the last word he said. And I just thought, well, I can't. And I just say to the students, we cannot go into this now. Just like we can't discuss at great length what does the image of God mean. This would be overwhelming. So I consider the audience, typically sophomores. Yes, Bill.
Do you see room for evolutionary ideas within a Christian perspective?
Yes, I do.
And so is part of the argument as much to where how evolutionary psychologists have looked at that really what evolutionary psychologists could use is a Christian perspective to say God could use evolution,
right.
But you're so focused on the selfishness aspect that you lose this other aspect that Darwin and others talked about in terms of why is it important for these pro-social kinds of things? Because you live, because if you're with the group and you're not shut out of the group, you're far more likely to survive.
Right, and I do actually even use the acronym NEP at times, like naturalistic evolutionary psychology, because a scientist who's using the evolutionary approach need not be philosophically naturalist, and I should have clarified that earlier, for sure. But I think that's
See, because I think some, I mean, some of the social psychologists that you're saying that, like the ones who really push down the self-esteem movement, most of them really would be from an evolutionary perspective
Yes.
as well, but they realize the limit, how limited these others were focusing on from that perspective.
That's right. And Baumeister's one of them,
Yeah.
who appears to be paralleling every time. Looks like he gets all the grant money to write the things I'm interested in, so then I cite him. And Batson as well, with the issue of altruism. And do we have will? Lots of things are relevant, for sure. So that's a good clarification. It's not a slam on, but it appears to be, because that is the prevalent meta theory. So I have to keep saying it to the student. Remember, I even say to the student at various points that survival is a very important force. But survival to what end is what a Christian researcher asks. Yes, Paul.
I'm only plugging in with things I know something about, because obviously I'm not a psychologist. On the reducing aggression part, you had one of the forgiveness and so on, and you cited Enright and other people there. It's really interesting that some philosophers right now who are writing on forgiveness and in philosophy of law also are applauding that move, and at the same time nervous about some of the sort of the psychotherapy side of it, because it's positive in that it reduces aggression, and we give up resentment and forswear revenge and things like that. That's all positive. But at the same time, they're concerned that if you do it too quickly, it dehumanizes the other person. So if I just sort of blanketly or very quickly or in a knee-jerk reaction, I just forgive whoever does me harm, I'm not really treating the other person as a genuine human being who should take responsibility for their actions.
Well, when Enright and Worthington and others write about forgiveness, they write about a process, a very dynamic process where people go back and forth and stages and so forth. Yes?
Well, I was just sort of a step back. I don't know what forces drive evolutionary psychology versus cognitive.
I have a personal idea about that. I think psychology's quest to be taken seriously as a science, and because evolutionary theory is the prominent view in, say, biology. But there are biologists who are staunch evolutionary thinkers who think that EP is quantum leaps in logic and missing quite a bit, actually. There are some pretty substantive critiques of a lot of evolutionary theories. So do you have another interpretation?
No, well, I mean, Darwin really started it, really, in terms of the evolutionary theory in his writing, but as well, I mean, there has been some very bad. Some of it is not. It comes off as scientific. It's not. There's some aspects of it, how it's been presented, is not very scientific at all. It's after the fact kinds of stuff. I'm going to fit this, and so that's what makes it. It is a muddy. In some ways, a muddy area. I find aspects of it quite compelling, personally, from a faith perspective. But how it's been presented, that's what gets difficult. And so you could put up a number of different things and you could easily rip it apart. And then there's other aspects that are quite compelling.
One thing I was wondering from the biological perspective, E.O. Wilson started the sociobiology field.
Yep.
And so I'm wondering how you address that, or is that kind of what maybe that bridge is from sociobiology and evolutionary psychology sort of took that? Because I think the problem was if we're all self-centered, how do you deal with this altruistic behavior? And E.O. Wilson was kind of looking at that from the evolutionary perspective, and how do our genes transmit this altruistic, and what are the benefits of that? So how does that self-centered relate to this altruistic behavior? And so I don't know how that was integrated into evolutionary psychology.
Though many evolutionary psychologists don't want to be associated with sociobiology, which is another conversation for another time. I think we're finished. Have hope.